If the function of certain behavior is to mislead, and it misleads, then we have deception. Whether it's human deception, whether it's biological deception, it doesn't really matter. And when you apply this to self-deception, you get no paradoxes.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Vladimir Krstić. He is assistant professor at the United Arab Emirates University, and his work focuses on philosophy of mind, language, philosophy of deception. He has various articles on these topics, especially related to lying and deception. He has a book out relatively recently called with Cambridge Elements called "Deception and Self-Deception: A Unified Account," and that's going to be our focus for today. But with that, feel free to add anything. But welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Krstić.
Oh, if I may add, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great privilege to be here, honestly.
Thanks. So great to have you. So I want to just start with maybe just like a brief overview of what this element is, what the general topic is when we're thinking about deception and so on. Just a brief introduction, if that's all right.
Yes. So why I chose the element to when I was actually, maybe I can tell you why I chose self-deception in the first place. As a student, I always wondered why people do these things to themselves. I always thought that there's like a greater value in truth than anything else. Eventually, I realized that mental harmony is more important than the truth. And now I kind of appreciate that. I don't know whether, if I can be more colloquial, there's this joke when they ask a wise man, what's the secret of happiness? And he says, well, never argue with, pig-headed people, if I may say it. And this guy says, no, this is such a stupid advice. And the wise guy says, yes, I agree with you. So I think that there's a value in this kind of harmony, and self-deception is a kind of a self-protective mechanism. That doesn't mean, of course, that it's always good to deceive ourselves. And then when I started analyzing self-deception, I came across all these paradoxes, most famously talked about in Melle's book in 1987. And the more I read about these paradoxes, the more I started thinking, well, is this really in the phenomenon? Or we have these theories of lying and deception that when we apply to self-deception, we get all these weird results. And my idea was that actually self-deception is much less problematic than we think. The problem are theories of lying and deception, which when you apply them to some regular phenomena work rather well, like Newtonian physics. When you use Newtonian physics to measure the speed of your car or something like that, it works fine. But if you want to measure the distance between planets and their speeds, you get these weird results because it's not working. So that was the idea behind the book. Now, when I was choosing what kind of book I want to write, Element is not a real book, it's a short book. And one might say, well, it's easy to write a short book. I actually think it's more difficult to write a short book. I worked on this book for a very, very long time. I chose an element structure specifically because I wanted to prune the book from all kinds of redundancies. So when you read a book, that's at least my impression, an author always wants to dazzle you with how much they read. So you get lots of footnotes, you get lots of digressions, they're telling you all kinds of stuff. And sometimes it's difficult to go back to the argument. So what I wanted an argument that answers all the questions that are fundamental questions about deception and self-deception, but that doesn't go into these detailed digressions. So the element is like one giant journal article. That's the idea. And in this element, I wanted to offer a theory of deception that will also generate a non-paradoxical account of self-deception. And I genuinely think that this is the only account of deception that's capable of capturing both biological and psychological deception, which is psychological human deception, biological animal and plant deception, and self-deception, and even possible animal self-deception. So there are certain scholars who argue that lower level animals are also capable of self-deception, which is impossible on many analyses of self-deception. But on my view, it is possible. And I do think that conceptually, we can say that lower level animals can engage in self-deception, and maybe even AI. When you think about it, large language models are capable of forming representational states, like fireflies. And they're also capable of communicating with us. So which means that they're capable of deception. And there are papers that argue that, some AI systems, AI bots engage in deception. So if they can engage in deception, they can deceive. If they can form representational states, they can form false representational states. So they can be victims of deception. If they can engage in deception, and if they can be victims of deception, then conceptually they can mislead themselves. They can be victims of self-deception. So that's the project that I aim to pursue now. But I think that the element that I produced gives us a solid foundation for any future analysis of self-deception. So if you want to focus on paradoxes of deception and self-deception, fine, you can do that, but you can do it through this conceptual framework of the functional analysis. So what's the functional analysis? So I told you everything except what I'm actually doing. So my idea was this. Okay, so when we think about deception, human deception, we typically think that you need to intend to mislead someone. If I mislead you without intending to mislead you, we think that this is not deception. This was a kind of an accident or a mistake. So philosophers predominantly think that you cannot have interpersonal deception if the person who is the deceiver does not intend to deceive. And this is what causes paradoxes of self-deception. I can deceive you because you don't know my intentions. If you know that I want to deceive you, and if you know how I intend to do that, then you're not going to bite the hook. So for example, in poker, you know maybe that I want to deceive you, but you don't know how. But if you also know my plan, then my plan is not going to work. When you apply this to self-deception, well, you obviously get a paradox. I know my own intentions and I know my own plans. So I know that I want to mislead myself, deceive myself, and I know how. So how to deceive myself, it seems that it's impossible. And this is why philosophers typically try to remove this intention condition, and they say we deceive ourselves unintentionally. They come up with some kind of different mental states. We engage in pretense. There's whole lots of different ways of solving this. And what I was thinking, well, why do we posit that deceivers must intend to deceive them, to deceive their victims? There's a pre-theoretical intuition about deception, which is that deception is a success word. What does this mean? When I deceive you, I achieve something. I cannot fail. So deception cannot involve accidents or mistakes. Accidents and mistakes are not synonymous. An accident is when something happens by chance, randomly, and a mistake is when I do something wrong. Intending to deceive eliminates accidents and mistakes. If I intended to cause epistemic harm to you, and you ended up epistemically harmed as a result of my behavior, then this is not a mistake, and it's not an accident. And then I was thinking, okay, animals also engage in deception. Plants engage in deception. Not viruses. Oh my God, my brain just stopped. I can't remember. Fungi engage in deception, but they don't have intentions. So how do they engage in deception? Well, the function of the behavior or the trait that causes misleading is to mislead. So we don't need to posit intending to mislead. What we need is that the function of my behavior is to mislead. And I think that human deception can also be captured by this functional description. And this is what I think unifies this analysis of deception throughout all phenomena, throughout all the world. If the function of certain behavior is to mislead, and it misleads, then we have deception. Whether it's human deception, whether it's biological deception, it doesn't really matter. And when you apply this to self-deception, you get no paradoxes. I may want something, and I engage in certain behavior. The function of my behavior is to mislead, and I end up misled as a result of acting in a certain way. So we have self-deception, but we have no paradoxes because I did not really intend to deceive myself. I maybe wanted to release anxiety or something like that. But as long as the function of this behavior was to mislead, this is self-deception. Now, I don't know whether this sounds silly. Maybe I can give certain examples, or maybe you have certain questions. I like to talk. You need to stop me.
No, it's kidding. No, it's great. It's great. It's a good introduction. And I will kind of come back on different parts of that. So let's see. Yeah. So one of the sort of issues you brought up already, and definitely comes up in the book, is that, look, what about cases where it looks like you're intending some result, maybe, but you're intending not as to deceive per se, but like the means by which you end up achieving that result is by deception. Well, then it looks like you can deceive someone without intending to deceive.
Yes.
That seems like a counterexample to what we might call a kind of more traditional approach or intent-based approach.
What is fundamental for deception, I think, is that the victim was not misled by accident or by mistake. Right. Not that I intended to mislead, but that misleading was not an accident or a mistake. As long as we have a theory that can tell us why this was not an accident or mistake, then we can say that this was deception. And this is also rather important. I was actually just finishing a paper arguing that deception is not pro-tantal wrong. We kind of think that deception is wrong. And then this is a strong incentive for us to believe that it is wrong because I intend to do something wrong. If I don't intend to do something wrong, then how can deception be wrong? But deception is not wrong. So maybe we can talk about this later, but let me give you an example. Imagine you're in a bus and, someone steps on your foot really violently and the person says, "Oh, I'm sorry." And you say, "No, it's nothing. It didn't hurt at all." And it hurt like hell, So what you're doing here, you're not lying to the person. You're trying to be polite to the person because, the person didn't really want to harm you. And you don't want to say, "You really, really hurt me." You're just going to cause pain to this person and you're not going to achieve anything. But basically, you're engaged in deception. You're not intending to deceive. What the description of your intention is being polite. This is like a white lie. But in reality, you are engaged in deception, even though you don't intend to deceive. And this is not wrong in any sense, I think. But it's not wrong because I'm aiming for, my goal is just not to hurt your feelings. My goal is not to deceive you. I don't know whether this makes sense. Maybe I should have used. Actually, my favorite example is job interview example. I came up with this example when I was on the job market. And, we have this Philosopher's Cocoon website, which is amazing. I think it's really helpful. And one of the pieces of advice there was like, don't be yourself. Be this professional persona, develop this portfolio, tell them how you know exactly what you're going to do and how you're awesome at teaching. And, but this is basically telling me to act deceptively. Don't be yourself. It's like, okay, invent this person, come up with a better version of yourself. And, when I was trying to publish this paper, finally I published it after like 7 years. But when I was trying to publish this paper, most reviewers were really upset about this example. And why? Because we have this idea that deception is bad, but it's not bad. It's just how life is. And in the job interview, you're not really aiming to deceive anyone. You just want to get the job. But if you look at it, through this lens of biological deception, the function of your behavior is to mislead. You are presenting yourself as better than you really are. And we have examples of this in animal mimicry. There's lots of cases of animal mimicry that are analogous to the job interview example. This is the so-called auto-mimicry. When you're mimicking a trait that you already have, but you're just amplifying it. You have like goats with horns, and they have coloration on their faces that make their horns look bigger. Or like dogs that also have coloration that make their teeth look bigger. So, the goat has horns, the dog has teeth, but the teeth are much smaller and the horns are smaller than what we can see. This is auto-mimicry. This is deception. So I'm not saying that, if you are inventing this persona that's super professional, that you're not professional. No, you are professional. But if you just come out of your grad school, of course, you don't really know exactly how your courses are going to look like. When you're going to when I was applying for this job, I didn't really know where I'm coming. I'm coming to a Muslim country, a completely different country from where I was. But for example, my first real job was in Kazakhstan. And I got this job from New Zealand. And they would ask me lots of stuff about students in Kazakhstan. How would you do this? How would you do that? I Googled Kazakhstan, I did my research, but in reality, I didn't really know what to expect. I was very happy there. I would warmly recommend, this was one of the best experiences that I had. In professional terms, the students were amazing because they're picked. I was teaching highly talented kids. It was amazing, but I had no idea where I was going. So when I would say, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I was actually stabbing at the answer. And I wasn't doing it because I wanted to trick someone. I wasn't like, okay, I got them now. No, I just wanted the job. And the same was here. I had certain ideas of how the students are going to be here, what the environment is, how things are going to work. But in reality, I was scared. I was changing the environment, but I'm not going to come to the interview and say, look, I'm really scared and I'm really nervous about this. I don't know exactly whether these things that I plan on doing, whether they're going to work out and so. So you're not going to say that in an interview. And it's not a bad thing if you don't say it. It's a good thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if someone could say in response that, okay, maybe it's good overall, like sort of pro toto, it's acceptable or good that you do that. But like, I don't know, maybe it'd still be better if you didn't have to mislead them, like all else equal, yes. Right? So like, what do you think?
This is such a great point. Thank you so much for doing this. I actually am trying to argue that deception is not pro tanto wrong, or you want to say prima facie wrong. It's actually regrettable. What you said here is that, yes, this is what we need to do. And maybe it's not wrong, but it's kind of regrettable that we need to do this, right? So I think that there are certain instances of deception. They're definitely not wrong. So maybe we can find arguments to say, okay, this job interview, you shouldn't be doing this, or maybe, this is a wrong thing to do, but it's justified given the circumstances and the good outweighs the bad. But I think that in certain circumstances, there's absolutely nothing wrong about deception. Now, I don't talk about this in the element. I don't know whether you want, maybe I can briefly discuss it. Would you be interested in hearing that?
Yeah, sure, briefly.
Okay. So consider, for example, double bluffs. So bluffing is basically lying. It's just you lie verbally, but you can bluff in various ways. You can pretend that you are confident or whatever. Double bluffing occurs when the victim expects me to lie, and then I pretend that I'm lying. So Saint Augustine had this famous example. You intend to take a certain road, and I know that the road is besieged by bandits. There are bandits on the road. But I also know that you don't trust me. You maybe think that I'm associated to the bandits or whatever, so you expect a lie. And I want to help you. So because you expect a lie, I pretend that I'm lying. So knowing that the bandits are on the road, I tell you there are no bandits on the road. And I tell you that there are no bandits on the road, hoping that you will say, okay, Vlad is lying. So if Vlad tells me that there are no bandits on the road, there are bandits on the road, which is what I want you to believe. Now, one might say, okay, this is obviously a case of where deception is wrong, but the good outweighs the bad. It's bad that you deceive your victim, but you save their life or you save them from this harm that's going to come. So the good outweighs the bad. But I want to ask is, was there any possible way of me avoiding deception in this case? If I tell you there are bandits on the road, which is true, you're going to infer that there are no bandits on the road, and you're going to take the road and you're going to be robbed. So if I tell you the truth, I deceive you. If I tell you, that's not a lie. If I say something false, there are no bandits on the road, you're going to infer a true belief, but I still cause you to believe that I intend to deceive you and send you down the road that's a bad road. Now I can tell you, look, I know that you expect a lie, but I'm a nice guy and I'm not going to lie to you, so I'm going to tell you the truth. There are no bandits on the road. Since you think that I'm dishonest, you're going to say, okay, so he told me that he's not going to lie to me. He's double bluffing. So if he's double bluffing, I should expect a triple bluff. So this is an endless chain of deception. There's no way in which I can not deceive you. I don't know whether you watched Princess Bride. Have you seen Princess Bride? Remember the
Yes.
poison thing. The context of distrust is such that I cannot just tell you, you should trust me. I know that you don't trust me, but you should trust me. There's no way in which I can avoid causing harm to you. So if I cannot avoid causing harm, how can I be culpable for deceiving you? Right? There's nothing that I can do from preventing you from acquiring a false belief. I can just choose what kind of belief you're going to acquire. So it's not my fault. Can I give you a different example? Imagine that I'm a field, maybe there's a better example, because this is, I'm currently in this philosophy of action stuff, and I wrote some papers on lies, and I was distinguishing non-intentional from intentional behavior. Consider this example. You have a field medic in the war zone, and he finds a soldier, and the soldier has been badly hurt in his leg, and the leg is gangrenous. And if we don't remove the leg, the soldier is going to die. So the field medic hacks off the leg right there on the battlefield. Now, is the field medic culpable for killing the leg? The field medic did something bad. He caused harm to the soldier. But was this avoidable? Was there any way in which the field medic could have saved the soldier's life and the leg? No. If the field medic says, I cannot harm this person, I can give him painkillers, I can give him medicine, but if I cut off something, that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing to cause harm to people, so I'm not going to cut off the leg. If he doesn't cut off the leg, the soldier will die and the leg will die. If he cuts off the leg will die. So whatever the field medic does, the leg will die. So why should he be culpable for doing what he's doing? So I think that double bluffs, benevolent double bluffs, are on a par with this kind of behavior. You're in a situation in which there's a bad outcome that you cannot avoid. What you can do, you can make lemonade when life gives you lemons, or you can allow a greater harm to happen. So that's why I think that in certain circumstances, deception is regrettable. It is regrettable that the field medic has to kill the leg, but it's not wrong. And it's not like, oh, this is justifiable. It's not just justifiable, it's the morally right thing to do. And it's the only thing to do. It's the only right thing to do. And I think the same applies to benevolent double bluffs. It's not that benevolent double bluffer did something wrong, but the good outweighs the bad, and that's why he's justified in deceiving. No, he did the only morally right thing to do. And in this case, since deception is unavoidable, we cannot say that the person is culpable. So in this case, it is regrettable that we have to engage in deception, but it's the right thing to do. That's what I think. And I think that most puzzles about deception and self-deception are actually caused by these misconceptions that we have. Like liars have to assert something they believe is false, deceivers must intend to deceive, deception is pro tanto bad or prima facie bad, whatever you want to say. No, deception is not necessarily bad in any sense. It is regrettable that we sometimes have to deceive. It is regrettable that we sometimes have to deceive ourselves, whether we know it, whether we don't know it, but it's not necessarily bad. You know, animals and plants engage in deception all the time, but we're not going to say it's bad. No, someone might say, well, you know, deception is morality is strictly human thing. Okay, maybe, but I think the double bluffs, benevolent double bluffs, still show, strongly at least indicate that deception is not always wrong. And once we accept the idea that deception is not necessarily bad, then I think it will be easier for us to accept that sometimes when we're polite to people on the bus, or, you know, if you tell me, okay, Vlad, you look good or something like that, even though I look terrible, you didn't do anything wrong. It's the right thing to do. Even in the job interview, you know, okay, this is just how the world functions. The world functions in a certain way, and, you know, it's not necessarily bad. That's my opinion.
No, that's really fascinating. I do want to move on to exploring your account more, but just one final remark on this. Like, I suppose maybe the only, or one of the only plausible replies or objections would be to say something like, well, maybe it's coherent to suppose that an action could be pro tanto bad, even if in some circumstance, like, there's nothing better that could have been done. Is that coherent?
Yeah,
not so clear.
Yeah, look,
yeah.
I'm perfectly happy that someone comes up with a better argument, because, you know, I actually started thinking that deception is constituted by manipulation, and I wanted to resolve the paradoxes of self-deception by advancing a manipulativist conception of deception. And I wrote my PhD thesis about that, and I started with papers, and then I read Artiga and Paternotti's functional analysis of deception. And I was like, okay, you know, I was wrong. So hopefully one day someone's going to come up with something better. But, you know, my contribution is still going to be us moving on from what I think is a failed analysis of deception and self-deception. And maybe someone is going to come up with something better. And if this happens, I'll be perfectly happy to accept it. You know, so maybe my current argument on whether deception is regrettable or not, or whether it's wrong or not, maybe it's false, I don't know. But even if it's wrong, okay, it's just, then the reality will be that we often engage in behavior which is wrong, but it's justified.
Right. Yeah, fair. And that's sort of secondary to giving an analysis of deception, which so just to sort of lay it out a bit more, then your preferred sort of functional account, as I understand it, says something like, when you have some behavior or even like a trait that misleads, then and its function is to mislead, and that's a sort of critical aspect. Then it's a deception has occurred. So can you expand on that a bit? Like how are you thinking about that?
Okay. So I kind of embellished Artiga and Patel. Actually, Don Fallis is the first to come up with this idea. He was just talking about this information. If I may say something nice about Don Fallis, I think that he's so brilliant and he makes arguments look so simple that we often fail to see how brilliant he is. Because, he just says like, okay, this is blah, blah, blah. And you think, yes, of course, this is so easy. But then you think about it, no one came up with this. No one, So Don, you're amazing. If you ever watch this podcast, and I hope you will, you're amazing. You're the best. So I embellished this idea by appealing to Garçon's distinction between proximal proper functions and results. So if I may explain what this is. So Garçon has this idea, what is the function of heart? Is the function of heart to sustain life? Well, no. If my lungs stop or if my brain stops, I'm going to die even if my heart continues to pump. So what is the function of heart? And Garçon says proper functions are proximal functions. What does this mean? The function of the heart is to beat. That's the first thing that the heart does. The result of heart beating is circulation of blood. Because how do we know this? Well, you can have heart beating without circulation of blood. That's when you separate the heart from the blood vessels. So the function of the heart is to beat, and then we have the result. Why is this important? Well, the function is deception, but I don't have to have the function in mind when I want something. I may want a result of certain thing. So how does this apply to deception? Say that I tell you that, I'm your rich uncle from Nigeria, and I got like billions or zillions of dollars, and I just need $10 from you to help me to wire it because my money is blocked. What is that I want? I want your money. That's the result that I want. How do I get the result? By misleading you. And that's the function of my lie. The proximal function of my lie is to cause you to acquire a false belief. The function of the heart is to pump. Once the heart pumps, the blood will start circulating. Once you acquire a false belief that I'm your rich uncle from Nigeria, you will send me the money. That's the result. And this distinction between proximal functions or functions and results of behavior helps me to resolve the paradoxes. I want a certain thing from you, and I need to know what I want. I need to know what I intend. So I need to know the result. But the function is not necessarily something that I need to know. And I use this to explain on the example of fireflies. So fireflies are a kind of favorite example of philosophers who do biological deception and the nature of signaling, just like, the beer in the fridge example. The fireflies example, what's the example? So let's say we have a meadow and there are three kinds of fireflies, or we can just say two, for example. We have two species of fireflies on a meadow. We have this Photinus firefly that she sends a signal of a certain color. Why does she send this signal? So female fireflies are on the grass, and male fireflies fly over the meadows, and male fireflies want to mate. So they send a specific signal that's relevant to their species. So they would, let's say, yellow-green flash. And if the female of their species on the ground is ready to mate, she's going to send yellow-green flash back. Once she sends the flash, the male descends. But there's this evil firefly, Photuris, She realized that if she sends a signal of a specific color, like yellow-green flash, her food comes down and she can eat. What is her food? Her food is male firefly Photinus. So what we have here is two fireflies. One firefly is ready to mate, the other firefly is hungry. And through process of evolution, the females Photinus learned that sending a certain kind of a signal brings the food down, which is the male firefly Photuris. Oh my God, I confused all the fireflies, but the point is this. Firefly A has a specific color signal, which is a sexual signal. Predator fireflies from the group B exploit this signal to eat. And we know this is deception because the male descends to mate, not to get eaten. But the predator firefly, doesn't send a signal thinking, oh, I'm going to mislead this guy and then I'm going to eat him. No, she simply signals the food to come down. She doesn't know that her signal is misleading. And I think that in human deception, we have the same thing quite often. I want a certain thing, I want the food to come down, and I engage in certain behavior, I send a certain signal, but the function of this behavior is to mislead. And that's how we get this functional analysis of deception. Of course, this doesn't mean that I never know that I'm engaged in deception. When I intend to get your money by causing you to believe falsely that I am your uncle from Nigeria, my intending to mislead you is actually giving us the function of my lie. So intentional behavior also has a function.
Right. Very, very good. And you mentioned Garçon there and the elements you talked more about.
Paternotte, they developed this functional analysis from Patelis was first, and I think his name is Justin Garçon. That's a really good book on functions. He's a really good philosopher as well, if I may comment.
Yeah, and he has a generalized selected effects account or approach.
Yes, function.
Right. So I did want to ask, like, how we're thinking more rigorously about what a function is, and is it just something purely biological? But I know you want to extend it sort of beyond that into things that can be developed in social and so on interactions. So maybe talk a bit how you're thinking about function more rigorously there.
This is the question that I was skillfully trying to avoid. Artiga, I think it was with two authors. So Garçon wrote a paper, it was recently published by the British Journal of Philosophy of Science, in which he and his co-author, I forgot the co-author's name, defend this proper functions or proximal functions account. And soon after that, Artiga and his co-authors wrote a response to Garçon, where they argued that some functions are distal functions. I am trying to remain relatively, how to say it, I think that even if you reject this function and result distinction and appeal to proximal functions and distant functions, you can still hold my view. So we can just say the proximal function is to mislead and the distant function is to benefit from your money or something like that. I am trying to, so Garçon's view is my preferred view, but I don't think that if we accept a different kind of functions, my view will collapse. One might think, okay, so you're appealing to an analysis of deception. You're defining deception by appealing to an analysis of function, and functions are already like very difficult to define what function is. I kind of understand that, but intentional behavior is also difficult to understand. We cannot just abandon certain project just because there's another project that is even more complicated. What I think is that even if we don't know everything about functions, I think that we know enough about function to understand what it means that a certain thing has a function to mislead. I don't know whether this is a sufficiently good answer. I was once actually pushed by a reviewer for philosophy and phenomenological research. The paper was on self-deception. I was defending this functional analysis. And the reviewer liked the idea, but they wanted to know exactly how things acquire functions. And I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? This is like a book project. So I couldn't do it, and they didn't accept the paper. I simply think that I do not have mental capacities to solve the problem of functions and then apply it to deception and self-deception. Maybe in future, I'm gonna do a project where I'll be able to do this, and that's gonna make complete sense of self-deception and deception. At the moment, I'm kind of content with the idea that what we know about functions so far makes my analysis coherent. And I think that my analysis is a substantial improvement of our current received analyses of deception and self-deception. I don't know whether this will satisfy people, but this bald guy at the moment cannot do any better.
No, yeah, that's really fair, and of course, especially for an element, I wouldn't expect a full account of everything. But
yeah, I mean, we can't have
especially something so difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I talked to Mark Artiga. He's also a really swell guy. I was in Valencia. He's in Valencia. I was in Valencia. I think it was 3 years ago or 2 years ago. And he also said, like, it doesn't really matter what kind of an analysis of function you accept. You can even go for an etiological view. Artiga and Panerotte go for this etiological analysis of function. I'm not really sure. I like Gerson's view, but I'm happy to be neutral with respect to that. And actually, my first paper on self-deception goes this way: proximal and distant functions. I call them epistemic and practical function. It's a 2020 paper. I like function and result better because it clearly tells me what constitutes deception and what is the product of deception. Because what constitutes deception is when you mislead someone. What constitutes deception is not that you give me money, but that you believe that I'm your rich uncle from Nigeria. You can give me money out of pity. You can say, oh my God, poor Vlad, he is this professor who wrote a book on deception and he cannot even deceive me. I'll just give him money out of pity. So I got what I wanted, but I didn't deceive you. And, and on my view, it's clear. Well, because the function hasn't been satisfied, even though the goal was satisfied, the goal was to get your money. I got your money, but I didn't do it the way I'm supposed to do it if I'm deceiving you. So that's why I prefer Gerson's view. But I don't think that abandoning it will undermine the functional analysis of deception.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. I did want to bring up a quick, well, maybe it's not so quick. One worry that someone might have and it's a worry that might plague various functional accounts of things that are sort of tied to the actual history. You might think, okay, maybe this is kind of science fictional, but like, Davidson had this kind of swamp man thought experiment, and the thought is like, well, if someone sort of just popped out of a swamp, without any sort of history that would be relevant to plausibly relevant to producing the sort of biological functions in question or other sorts of functions, then, well, I guess they couldn't. It wouldn't have followed that they couldn't realize the relevant functions to deceive or to have meaning or to have whatever. But on the other hand, possibly we think that someone like that could deceive someone. Like, well, they could just start doing the sort of things that standard deceivers do. Do you see the worry that I'm getting at there? And if so, what do you think?
You know what I'm then thinking? Well, if we cannot have functional behavior in this context, then we also cannot have intentional behavior. So if it undermines my view, then it undermines the idea that deception needs to be intentional. And even if we remove the functional analysis, even in biological deception, we can go for the signaling-based sender-benefit analysis of deception. The sender-benefit analysis of deception says, we have deception, we have deceptive signal. If the signal carries misinformation, and sending this signal systematically benefits the sender at the receiver's expense, some people have. So this systematic benefit condition is supposed to eliminate mistakes and mere accidents from deception. But if the function of the behavior is not to benefit the sender, then the correlation might be accidental as well. Like two clocks in, Leibniz had this idea that mind and body are like two perfectly synchronized clocks. You can have the same when you talk about deception. So I think that this argument, if it undermines the functional analysis of deception, it's going to undermine any other analysis of deception. But I might just be misunderstanding what you said.
No. I see that. Although I don't know. I think there's something intuitive to the idea that, I don't know. We're having this conversation right now, and there's obviously there's intentions behind it, and so on. And in principle, I could deceive you in some way, or you deceive me. But that, whether that's the case, seems sort of independent from whether, I don't know, 1 minute ago we just popped into existence out of nothing. Is that possible that could have happened, even granting what we're sort of holding fixed here? I think there's something intuitive about that, but I don't know. Yeah.
I think that this would constitute accidental misleading or misleading by mistake. And then I think that in the beginning, how things acquire functions, I mean, it's a $1 million question. But I think that we acquire functions, things acquire functions in the beginning by accidentally generating benefit. So how did this female Futurist started sending yellow-green flash? They were probably sending flashes of all kinds of colors, but those females that would send yellow-green flash, they would eat. And those who would eat, they would continue to exist. This is how natural selection simply works. So I think that the person who maybe just fell from the moon or something like that, they might be able to cause epistemic harm, but in the beginning it would have been accidental. And I'm not sure that we can just fall from the sky and engage in intentional behavior. I'm not sure. I don't know, maybe just beyond my intellectual capacities to understand Donald Davidson.
Right. Fair enough. And that's a whole other conversation, I suppose. But and then one more potential puzzle here, or maybe there'll be more, but maybe it's not a puzzle per se. But do you think there's potential vagueness in what counts as deception? I don't know. It might be sort of vague whether something counts as realizing a particular function on some occasion. Is that its function? Maybe sort of. Do you think there's room for sort of vagueness, or maybe even indeterminate cases of whether something counts as deception?
That's an excellent question. I think that there's a huge, there's a gray area where we misclassify something as deception that's actually not deception. And in hindsight, or I don't know how to pronounce it in English, is it hindsight, right? Or hindsight? When you...
Hindsight.
In hindsight, maybe I made a mistake by going for a shorter book, maybe I should have had a long chapter on what should not be classified as deception. And at the moment, I'm working on that. I think that there's a much broader spectrum of failures that can result in causing epistemic harm to others that should not count as deception. And currently, I'm also working on a paper that is trying to systematize these failures. Maybe I should talk more about accidents and mistakes and errors, just to make sure what I'm trying to say. So Austin first distinguished accidents from mistakes and from errors. And he had this example with donkeys. And he said, imagine that you and I both have a donkey and they're in the field. And one day I wake up, I'm really grumpy, nervous, and I decide to shoot my donkey. So I aim and I shoot, I identify my donkey, I shoot and I kill, an animal falls, I come closer and I see that I actually killed your donkey. So what I thought was my donkey was actually your donkey. Was this an accident? No, but it was a mistake. I made a mistake. Now, consider this situation. I wake up, I'm angry, blah, blah, blah. I identify my donkey, I shoot towards my donkey, but my donkey moves and I kill your donkey. Now, what am I going to say? Was this a mistake? No, I was actually aiming for my donkey, but it was an accident. My donkey moved and I killed your donkey by accident. Now, Austin doesn't talk about errors. He doesn't give an example. I assume that an error would be that, I wake up angry, I see my donkey, I aim correctly, but my gun somehow misfires or it's not accurate enough and I shoot your donkey. That would be an error. An error is like an inaccuracy. Now we have three things to distinguish that are not deception. How would this apply to deception? Imagine that I think that Sydney is the capital of Australia. And you ask me what's the capital of Australia, and I say it's Sydney. I mislead you, but I don't deceive you. I was mistaken. Imagine that, my favorite example is Commissioner Gordon. So I like the beer in the fridge example. So imagine that, Commissioner Gordon calls Batman by using this Krieg light. And imagine, one night Commissioner Gordon is just chilling, watching the stars, and he goes to grab his beer and he accidentally presses the switch and he calls for Batman. He misleads Batman, but he doesn't deceive Batman. It was an accident, he maybe tripped and fell. And an error would be if I would miscalculate something, for example, and give you the wrong result. I didn't deceive you, I misled you by an error. I think that the spectrum of these failures is much broader. And I'm at the moment trying to sort out this gray area so that we could be able to distinguish what really counts as deception from what doesn't count as deception. I don't know whether you read Chisholm and Thean have this paper where they distinguish deception by commission from deception by omission, and they have deception. It's an old paper, but it's a really seminal paper. It's a good paper. I'm trying to do something similar, though it's not going to be as seminal as Chisholm and Thean, but I'm trying to do something that will kind of give us this pre-theoretical tool to see what is going on. So I'm in the process of being able to answer your super cool question. That's the short answer to your question.
No, good. And then I guess broadly, the sort of concern someone might have for this account are that, well, one, they might think it overgeneralizes. Sorry. Perhaps you talked about animal and even plant, like mimicry, for example. But someone might say, but is a plant having, colors that look like something else, and that leads, bugs to do certain things. Is that really deception? Like, it just seems like too, I don't know, not too weak to count as deception in an ordinary sense or something like that. Or on the other hand, it might not be clear, sort of on the other extreme, that because your account is in a way kind of so broad that it's not clear that how it'll handle or that it'll correctly handle maybe very complicated or cases of deception where I don't know, it's built up on very complex social interactions and so on that someone's deceiving. And it's like, yeah, so maybe if you comment on sort of both sides of that.
That's a very good objection. So one very intuitively plausible objection to my view is, well, it makes it so simple. And, self-deception in particular is not really simple. What I want to say is that my view is not that all deception is simple and that all self-deception is simple. No, you can have a very complex kind of deception, very complex kind of self-deception. I'm also not negating that some self-deceivers intend to deceive themselves. And actually, I think that we can even deceive ourselves by lying to ourselves. I have one paper on that topic. And I'm trying to develop an account of lying that explains this theoretically. I'm currently working on that. Sorry. My view is just that once you strip all of these complexities down, you end up with the fact that, the function of the thing that misleads is to mislead. No matter how complicated the mechanism is, the function of the mechanism is going to be to mislead. If the function is not to mislead, then misleading is going to be by accident, by mistake, by error, or by some other kind of failure that shouldn't count as deception. That's my idea. So I'm not negating that in self-deception, sometimes we have paradoxes. I'm not negating that some self-deceivers know the truth deep down. I'm not negating all of those, the tension. All of these things are possible. But these are not the things that are necessary for self-deception. So you don't really need to know the truth deep down. It's not necessary to have tension. You can still have self-deception even without tension. This is what I'm trying to say. So I'm just trying to make the phenomenon conceptually less puzzling. Once we strip down these problems, then we can focus on more specific issues about self-deception. That was my idea. So the book is not like, okay, here's a manual to self-deception. I've solved everything for you. No, the idea is like, look, deep down, when you go to the bottom of the things, it's actually very simple. And once you go from this simple, then we can move on to explain further nuances, further complications within the phenomenon itself.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. And you mentioned self-deception there. I feel like maybe we should discuss that a little more. So how does this get applied to self-deception, and and how do you think that resolves at least some of the worries that came up with the traditional approaches?
Explaining self-deception in simple terms is really, I don't think it's possible. To just say, okay, this is exactly what happens in self-deception. Self-deception can proceed in zillions of ways. And that's why I think the broadness of I think that this is a really good thing about my account is that it doesn't posit that self-deception has to have a specific product. It doesn't posit that it has to have a specific motive or something like that. So the final chapter of the book talks about the result of self-deception, why we engage in self-deception. I'm saying there's no such, we don't have a single answer to this question. I think that's really important. But in reality, self-deception is very simple. I trigger a mechanism in myself. The function of this mechanism is to mislead in general, and I mislead myself by, triggering this mechanism. I might want to reduce anxiety. I might want to impress someone. I might want to, whatever result I want, it doesn't really matter. As long as I do this by engaging in a certain behavior or activating a certain trait that misleads me, we're going to have self-deception on this very basic level. Now, when you talk about specific cases, this can happen in millions of ways. And this depends on the kind of personality, on the situation, on what is at stake. So, many accounts have this, I think, really awkward consequence that there are people who are more prone to self-deception from people who are less prone to self-deception. I think that's not true. I think that there are many factors that really affect this, including what is at stake. And one person may engage in self-deception in a certain context, but not in a different context about the same thing. So, for example, I don't really care whether I have hair or not. But when I was 25, I would be really worried about this because I would want, the girls to like me. Now I'm married and my wife likes me. I think she likes me. So I don't really care. It's her problem that her husband is bald. It's not my problem. But when I was 25, I would have much more incentives to deceive myself about my looks than now when I'm 45. So I think that the amount of factors that we need to take into account when we talk about self-deception is humongous. And most of the time when I read papers and I read these cases, I think they're grossly under-described. Dana Nelkin, actually, in a paper, I can't remember the name of the paper, but it was published by Pacific Philosophical Quarterly. She raises this concern. She says, these cases are under-described. You tell us the person is deceiving him or herself and blah, blah, but why? It's not really clear. And that's because self-deception is such an intricate phenomenon and such a complicated thing to understand that I think requires a case-by-case analysis. But deep down, when you strip of all of these complexities, you end up with a very simple Firefly analogous functional description. This is the behavior, the function was this, and this is what we got.
Yeah. All right. And then more on the self-deception stuff, we might worry that if we're giving a functional account of deception and applying that to self-deception as well, that there's something sort of in tension if we suppose that you deceive yourself in a way that's sort of unwelcome or not to some benefit to yourself. Because then there's a sort of functional role to do something counterproductive to you. It sort of seems at best in tension. So yeah, I mean, you spent some time talking about this. Maybe briefly, what do you think?
Yeah. Thank you very much for this question. A natural concern that arises with respect to my view is, well, if it has to have a function, then it has to be adaptive. So what are we going to do with unwelcome self-deception? I think that it's a misconception to think that everything that's functional is adaptive. Sometimes the selection process just needs some time to deselect maladaptive or non-adaptive behaviors. And sometimes social or any other contextual things can actually facilitate maladaptive behavior. Let me give you, I think I talk about this in the element, but I have one really example that's dear to my heart is fainting goats example. So if you Google it, if you just Google fainting or nervous goats, you're going to see these goats that when you scare them, they completely freeze and they even fall. It's like in a cartoon. And these goats still exist. So, fainting in the face of danger is not really adaptive. It's a very maladaptive trait. So why do we have these goats? Well, actually, farmers found this trait really helpful because they didn't have to build large fences. When the goat would try to jump over the fence, the goat would freeze midair. It would be afraid, and they weren't able to jump over fences. So even though the trait is maladaptive, the historic or context was such that someone found use for this. Or another example is heightened fearfulness in human infants. So I was writing a response to one psychologist was writing a paper, wrote a really large and interesting paper, how heightened fearfulness in human infants is adaptive. So human infants are only mammal infants that cry or exhibit fear when there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. So you know how mothers sometimes, the baby is crying and we're giving them attention. Is it hungry? No, it's not hungry. Did it poop? It didn't poop. Why is it crying? Well, it's crying to get attention. Human infants sometimes cry to get attention, and they are afraid. They exhibit this heightened fearfulness when there's no reason to be afraid. You don't see this in mammals, in apes, or something like that. Why is that? Well, because humans can afford to allocate resources even when it's not necessary. If we were living in the jungle, and if the baby would only have parents, and the parents would have 5 babies, the baby that cries all the time probably wouldn't get this amount of attention, and the baby would stop crying. But we're social beings. So if parents cannot allocate attention to the baby, their grandparents, their uncles, their aunts, their neighbors. So human society is such that it can allocate unnecessary resources and compensate for the maladaptive feature of a certain kind of behavior. Notice, when the baby cries and exhibits fearfulness in the absence of danger, this is not only maladaptive, it's also deceptive. The parents think that the baby is hungry, but the baby just wants attention. So this is deception. The baby is engaged in deception. And this deception is working because the parents can afford to allocate resources to the baby. And the more, this is more exaggerated in societies that have large families. So in societies where you only have this nuclear family, babies cry less than in societies where you would have large families living together. You have many societies that have this kind. My wife is Kazakh, and for them, family is like nearest 50 cousins. They're all family. And it's really interesting. It's really cool. Then everybody looks after everybody's children, and you can afford to allocate all these resources. So the fact that something is maladaptive doesn't necessarily mean that it's immediately going to be deselected by the process of evolution. Also, certain kinds of behaviors might have been adaptive in the past. Now they are not adaptive, but we just need some time for the process of evolution to evolution doesn't work like, abrupt shifts. You need to have these periods of transition. So I assume that certain kinds of maladaptive, self-deceptive behaviors will eventually disappear, but the process just needs time.
Yeah, that's very fair. And I suppose also if we're generalizing function beyond something evolutionary, then maybe like short-term functions could come up. Even if they're not adaptive or beneficial to you.
Yeah. Because adaptation is something that takes time. It's a trial and error thing, and deselecting it also takes time.
Right. I did a couple more things, and we can probably wrap up. But I did have a kind of more general methodological question. I mean, this comes up a little bit in the element, but maybe it'd be helpful to discuss it here a bit briefly. When theorizing about deception, to what degree is this a matter of how that term functions in like everyday thought and talk? Like, are there some empirical semantic issues like at all relevant, or to what degree, or what do you think? Yeah.
I kind of try not to completely focus on colloquial use of the term deception, because we often use it in a figurative sense. I can say, unless my memory deceives me, we agreed to meet today at 7, or, I can say your appearance deceives me. We sometimes, we can say my expectations were deceived, but my expectations cannot be deceived. They're not an agent. So we can say, your smile is a lie, or history contains, the statistics never lie. What does it mean, the statistics never lie? So I think that we can coherently talk about certain things by referring to them as deception, and we know what is going on. But I don't think that this is the kind of discourse that helps us to understand the concept itself. So while I don't completely negate this kind of analysis, I do not rely solely on it. And Amela was famously basing his argument on a lexical use of the term deceived. I think that was wrong. I think that because I can say, I only lied to you because I was deceived about the time of our meeting. But what I want to say is that I had a false belief about my meeting, that I wasn't a victim of deception. We can sometimes use deceived in terms of, to refer to something, a state in which I have a false belief, a state in which I'm mistaken, but that doesn't mean that there was any deception. It's just a figurative sense. So I try to be very careful there. What I do, I don't dismiss intuitions, I don't dismiss colloquialism, I don't dismiss, everyday conversation immediately, but I am kind of skeptical. I try to be very skeptical and to tread lightly regarding to everything. So I don't dismiss it, but I don't necessarily treat it as data. I want to see whether it makes sense. And what I'm principally focused on is misleading an accident, mistake, error, or any kind of a failure. If it is, then it's not deception. So I think that this is the most fundamental criteria that we need to apply when trying to understand deception. Deception is a success word.
Well, that's right. I guess the worry I have is like, well, and I know, yeah, in everyday discourse, these terms might get used in different and messy and non-literal ways and so on. But if we're not using at least some of that use as a guide to what we're theorizing about, then like, is it just a sort of conceptual engineering? Or are we just sort of developing something? How is that supposed to work then? Like, yeah.
Maybe I'm too separated from reality. Maybe I'm doing, I don't know. That's a really good, I need to think about this. Maybe, maybe I'm too nitpicky. I'll give you a story from my childhood. When I was a PhD student, I had this really great supervisor, John Bishop from Oakland. And I would write stuff and I would be super enthusiastic about this. And John he would look like this, he would have this snake eyes like Clint Eastwood. He would look at my paper and he would be like, but what about this word here? And I would tell him, John, you are so mean. You always find a question to ask. And he said, Vlad, I want you to become this meme when you read your stuff. So I think that I'm trying, maybe, hopefully, I'm like my supervisor, John, and I'm mean towards anything. I try not to accept anything unless I thought about it. So I repeat, I do not reject common folk intuitions and stuff like that, but I do try to be really mean towards that. And I try to be mean towards my work as well. I return to my work. I revise my positions. I abandon lots of my positions. Simply because I'm not really interested in being right. I really want to understand what is going on here. And again, following John, I think that philosophy is like poetry, and every word matters. So I try to be, I'm trying to be as sure as possible that when I say something, it's really justified to say it.
Right. That's good. Okay, we definitely explore more of the issues there, but I think.
But I think that this concern is really serious. That you just said that I'm like doing conceptual engineering. Thank you so much for that. This was really helpful. You've just given me a headache. Okay, I will.
By the way, I don't mean to imply that there's something necessarily wrong with conceptual engineering. And that might be, I mean, it's often quite useful to sort of repurpose a term maybe that's used in loose various ways in every language and make it more precise for some sort of more philosophical discourse or something else. Like, I mean, that happens in science all the time and so on. So I don't mean to say there's something wrong with that. But
I'm trying to understand a real life phenomenon, so I cannot just separate myself from real life. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, no worries. So a lot of good stuff there, and I definitely recommend people check out this element. You may have access to it, open access to it through I guess it's not open access, but you might have access to it through an institution, or I mean, it's not very expensive either, but it's something worth checking out. It's an interesting topic on Cambridge University.
Well, I don't know whether I can say it publicly, but they can always email me and I can send. So I think that most universities now have like agreement with CUP where you can get this for free. But if you don't have this agreement, just email Vlad, and I'll just send you my draft or something. I'm not doing this to sell the book. I just I want people to read something. I want a dialogue. So if you can't buy the book, just email me and I'll send you a draft. It's perfectly fine. I don't know.
No, I think that's good, unless CUP has an issue with that. But I do like to end with a kind of general meta-philosophical question. It's a broad question, but let me know what you think. What do you think is the kind of value of philosophy? Like, why is philosophy worth doing? Mm-hmm. Like that sort of thing. Maybe for you, or more generally.
I think that the value of philosophy is that it gives meaning to everything. So in this university, I'm part of cognitive sciences department, and we have linguists and psychologists. And the students recently asked me, what's the value of philosophy? But sadly, in this country, I don't think that people see the value of philosophy. And I think it's actually because it doesn't, today, people assign meaning to utility. If it doesn't have utility, then it's meaningless. You need to have certain kind of utility. But we're not plumbers. There's value beyond utility. And I think that philosophy gives logos to sciences. So, science is actually logos. In Greek, I read somewhere, my first degree was in theology. And when I was doing theology, we studied ancient Greek. New Testament was written in ancient Greek. And somewhere I read that logos actually has 72 different meanings. Ancient Greek is the most sophisticated language ever developed, if you ask me. And one of the meanings is actually meaning. So logos means word, science, logic, rationality, but it also means meaning. And philosophy is trying to find meaning in everything. You can have utility without having any real meaning. And when I was thinking about self-deception, I was thinking about not just about what is the mechanism that's happening here. I was trying to see what's the meaning of all of this. And actually, I didn't talk in this podcast, we didn't talk about the mechanism of self-deception. You asked me this, and then I kind of lost it. I'm sorry about this. There is a mechanism of self-deception. There's a way of recognizing self-deception. I think that you can identify self-deceivers by seeing whether people are acting the way they wouldn't normally act. I call it self-deceivers are not being themselves. Sorry, we didn't have time to talk about this. And I think that's the weakest part of the book. I'm trying to improve this. I wrote a paper. It was almost published 3 times. So it's like almost like one reviewer loves it, the other one hates it. Eventually, it will be out there. So I do work on the mechanism of self-deception as well. But the philosophy is like, I think that philosophy gives colors to the world. We don't need colors to it. It's like salt. I come from Eastern Europe, but I was never part of Soviet Union. But we had my childhood was good because we would get the best from the West and from the East. We would be able to watch Hollywood movies and all kinds, David Attenborough and all kinds of stuff that were really good from the West. But we would also get good stuff from the East. And there was this fairy tale. I remember when I was young, there was a fairy tale about salt. It was a Russian fairy tale, Russian movie. It was in Russian. We had subtitles. And the movie was about this king who had a beautiful daughter. The fairy tale was about this king who had a beautiful daughter, and he made an announcement that he wants to marry his daughter. So, kings from all over the world would send their sons with gifts to this king in order to, allow to get his blessing to marry the daughter. And some kings would bring diamonds, like tons of gold. And then one guy comes with lots of horses with some giant bags. And the king would say, "Oh, this is like you brought most stuff. What is this?" And the guy said, "Well, the prince said, this is salt." And the king said, "Well, salt is stupid. Why would I need salt? Who are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm the son of the king of salt, and we're giving you the most precious thing in the world. It's salt." And the king laughed at this prince of salt, and he kicked him out. And he said, "No one needs your stupid salt. I want gold." And the prince said, "Well, then I hope that all of the salt in your kingdom turns into gold." And the prince leaves. And really, all the gold in the kingdom, all the salt in the kingdom turns into gold. And eventually, the fairy tale says, eventually the people didn't enjoy their food. So the king would be like, "We don't care about salt," but the food was tasteless. And the king said, "Okay, let's eat sweets, but you can't eat cake all the time. You need food." So the king said, "Okay, let's take all the gold that we have, leave the kingdom, and buy salt for the gold." But every time they would leave the kingdom, the gold would turn into salt and back. So eventually, the king was begging this prince. But the idea was, what's the analysis? You have something so simple, salt, and you think it's meaningless. We don't need salt. Salt has no nutrients. It has no utility, but it gives flavor to everything. It gives flavor to our food. And I think that philosophy is the salt of the science. Maybe someone is going to take this in a wrong way. But what I want to say is that, okay, we don't have factories of philosophy. We are not going to cure cancer by doing philosophy. But we are going to give meaning to everything that we do if we do philosophy. And I think that every scientist who genuinely wants to have a meaningful discussion is a philosopher. I hope that this long answer makes sense. But I think that, we are both meaningless and incredibly important. And I think that this is the beauty of our job, and I like it. I love my job. And I think that it's priceless to do what we do.
Awesome. I definitely agree with that. Yeah, that was helpful insights there. But so thanks so much for coming on, Professor Krstić, and writing this element and giving your thoughts on it. It's been really great having you.
Thank you so much for this. I had lots and lots of